The US dollar might not be the global reserve currency by the end of this decade. Stanley Druckenmiller, an American billionaire who managed the quantum fund with George Soros and is a hedge fund manager himself, says he no longer, quote, expects the dollar to be the reserve currency within the next 15 years.
And that's why I said in that speech, yes, that I think it's more likely than not within 15 years we lose reserve currency status.
Welcome to This is Business. We make documentaries just like this one on money, power, geopolitics, economy, modern conflict, war, finance, etc. Subscribe for more. And this is The War on Global Reserve Currency. It all started at the end of World War II. 730 representatives from 44 allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, USA. This gathering was formerly known as the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. This monetary system established the rules for commercial and financial relations among the participant nations. Member nations would peg their currencies to the US dollar, and the US would peg the US dollar to gold at a price of $35 an ounce. This was known as the gold standard, where nations could buy US dollars in exchange for gold, use the dollars to purchase oil for their respective countries, or trade with other nations, and can exchange the dollars back for gold whenever they wanted, at least on paper. The dollar being the central currency for world trade forced the US to run a continuous trade deficit, or in other words, their imports outweighed their exports. By the early 1960s, the US dollar's fixed value against gold at $35 an ounce was seen as overvalued. Their reckless spending due to the Vietnam War and the welfare programs of the 1960s meant that the dollar was seen as being overvalued against its gold reserves. And then the worst that America could have imagined happened. It was a classic bank run. A few countries tried to withdraw the gold that they had sent to the United States for safekeeping. After a run on its gold reserves, US President Richard Nixon declared a temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold, and thus the original Bretton Woods system collapsed in August of 1971. By 1973, the free-floating fiat currencies had taken over the Bretton Woods system, and the dollar subsequently lost 20% of its value against gold. During the Fourth Arab-Israeli War in 1973, the US extended its unconditional support to Israel, which didn't make the Middle Eastern Arab states too happy. In retaliation, the oil-producing OPEC countries placed an oil embargo on the US. As a result of this, the price of oil quadrupled, causing a severe economic shock to the US and other oil-importing nations. And this added to the great inflation of the 1970s, increasing economic misery in the United States. In July 1974, President Nixon sent his Treasury Secretary William Simon on a secret mission to negotiate a deal with the Saudis in order to improve relations and bring down oil prices. As per the agreement, the US would buy oil from Saudi Arabia and provide the kingdom with military aid and hardware. In return, the Saudis would use their oil wealth, which had increased substantially given the price rise, to buy US treasuries, that is, US debt. This mechanism of pricing oil in just US dollars was soon adopted by other OPEC countries. This once again confirmed the hegemony of the US dollar as the mechanism for gold trade. As a result of this event, oil purchases in the British pound fell from 20% to just 6% of total world purchase within 2 years. This was referred to as the Petrodollar system, where oil was exclusively priced in US dollars, and the oil-producing nations, in return, plowed their oil revenue back into the United States. So this is how it all works under the Petrodollar system. If you want to buy oil from the OPEC nations, you would first need to exchange your currency for US dollars and then give it to the oil-selling nation in exchange for oil. Now, all the dollars are with the Saudis, and so to earn interest on those crazy amounts of dollar reserves, the Saudis would purchase US bonds, or in other words, US treasuries or US debt. The purchase of US treasuries with oil revenue helped to keep the US dollar strong and the US debt cheap. The US government, due to these foreign purchases of US debt, was able to keep borrowing costs lower and was free to generate even more larger sums of debt, which it used to finance wars, social welfare programs, etc. For the OPEC nations, it allowed them to park their excess money in US Treasury bonds, which were considered as one of the safest investment products around, given the long-term stability of the dollar system and the US government's creditworthiness, that is, implicit understanding of not defaulting on their debt obligations. Although it may sound strange to some of us, given that the US had just defaulted on their obligation during the Bretton Woods system. So this was a brief history of how the US was able to strengthen the dollar by making it the world's reserve currency and by doing so, confirming its hegemony. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the US and Europe employed some of the toughest sanctions they could think of against Russia, some of which were only employed against outcasted nations like North Korea, Venezuela, Iran, etc. Russia was removed from the SWIFT banking system, which almost all countries use as a messaging system to do cross-border payments. Various banks and financial institutions ceased all operations with Russia and also refused to do any transactions with entities inside Russia. However, here's where it gets interesting. The US might have crossed a line here, which it shouldn't have, by freezing Russian central banks' forex assets. As per reports, around half of Russia's $600 billion worth of forex reserves, which were outside Russia, have now been frozen. So, apart from throwing literally the whole kitchen sink at Russia, the US is also not letting Russia access its own money, about $300 billion worth. Sounds scary enough? Wait till you hear what the US can do to your country if it ever does something it's not supposed to. You see, under the petrodollar system, many central banks also parked their forex reserves and gold with the US and other Western nations for safekeeping. Many preferred to keep their assets overseas in the West to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands due to corruption or local unrest, and also keep it in safer US treasuries, which are less affected by the unpredictability of fluctuating local currencies. Just in the span of 2 years, both the Afghan and Russian forex reserves overseas have been frozen with a, quote, single click of a button. Already a portion of the $7 billion of the Afghan reserves is going to be split among the 9/11 families and other humanitarian assistance. So in Afghanistan's case, even if relations normalize with the ruling Taliban elite, or even if they are overthrown by a friendly, quote-unquote, democratic regime, some of the money may not go back as it has already been given away. And as we have seen in the Ukraine war, it is hard to say how much of the humanitarian assistance actually reaches the ones in need. It is very likely that most of those $7 billion would end up in the pockets of a few elite millionaires or even billionaires. If a powerful country like Russia could have its central bank reserves frozen and given to the Ukrainians, it wouldn't be too far-fetched to assume something similar couldn't happen to any other country. Keeping aside the moral question of the money belonging to the Russians and the Taliban, this has opened a Pandora's box on whether the money in US treasuries and dollars especially parked overseas is safe or not. Even the Wall Street Journal, in its issue, stated with the headline, quote, "If Russian currency reserves aren't really money, the world is in for a shock. Any country that threatens the West or US alliance or dares to cross them could find itself on the wrong end of sanctions, including being pushed out of the dollar-based global monetary order." Nations which have gradually earned their forex reserves with years of traded surpluses will now be naturally cautious of putting their wealth at the mercy of other powers. With Russia being frozen out of the Western banking system, it will be hard to get dollars to transact with the rest of the world. The Russian central bank prevented citizens from exchanging rubles for dollars in order to stabilize their local currency. Even before 2022, Russia had been gradually increasing its trade with China in yuan rubles, that is, moving away from the dollar. Russia, on a daily basis, exports around $1 billion of natural gas to the rest of Europe. They are now asking the European gas importers to pay in rubles instead of dollars. This forces European nations to now exchange their dollars and euros for rubles to fulfill their energy payments to Russia. This creates more demand for rubles, helping stabilize their currency against the dollar or euro. India has also been using the rupee-ruble pair to avoid Khatsa sanctions. Now, with Russia being cut out of the financial system, this trade is bound to grow, given India's dependence on Russian military hardware, spare parts and cheap oil due to the sanctions. If more nations start moving away from the dollar system to de-risk themselves from ending up in a position like Russia, it slowly eliminates dollar hegemony in the long run. Already, OPEC nations such as Saudi Arabia have sought to explore deals to sell oil to China in yuan versus dollars. Since the past 7+ years, foreigners have been net sellers of US treasuries versus being net buyers pre-2015. Now, let's say hypothetically, if other nations were to start selling US treasuries on a net basis more aggressively than ever before, then that would increase the cost of borrowing for the US government, which is already facing high levels of debt. To keep interest rates low, the Federal Reserve would have to step in as a measure of last resort for buying these treasuries. Otherwise, with very high interest rates, it risks bringing down the whole highly leveraged and indebted financial system of the US. Let's say in the near future, if China were to invade or quote-unquote reunify Taiwan with mainland China, the first thing they would want to do is secure their forex reserves. Just like Russia, China can any day declare a special military operation in Taiwan, and given the US stance on this issue, it would literally trigger World War III. China invades Taiwan, US steps in and declares war on China, and due to NATO, all other nations would be forced to go to war with China. You see, China has over $1 trillion worth of US treasuries in their portfolio. So, if it has plans for reunification with Taiwan, they will want to sell these treasury bonds before making any move on Taiwan. So if tomorrow you see in the news that China is selling all its treasuries, then you know what's about to happen. Any country by itself selling US treasuries might not have a massive impact, but if a significant number of countries follow through, there would be long-term issues for the dollar and the United States. Many smaller countries who have dollar-denominated debt can't print out of a crisis like how the US does. Being the reserve currency, the US can print more of its own currency combined with the foreign buyers of US treasuries allows US to print its way out of any financial crisis. However, the cost of all this printing of US dollars comes with bad consequences for other nations who now are mired even deeper into financial repression. During the COVID lockdowns, India had about $600 billion worth of foreign reserves, and that's exactly when the US decided to print more money. It is believed that around 40 to 80% of all US dollars were printed during the last 2 years. So, on paper, the value of all the US dollars was reduced by up to 80%. But because countries held on to their reserves, inflation was nowhere near the 40% mark. But in future, if something like this were to ever happen, we would likely see the biggest downfall of any reserve currency we have ever seen in history. Now, if commodity-rich nations such as Saudi Arabia and Russia suddenly decide to not use the dollar for global trade, then the trillion-dollar question is, what would be the next global reserve currency? Looking back at history over the past few centuries, one has seen that the global reserve currency has changed hands every 80 to 100 years. The dollar is nearing the 80-year mark also, so this could just simply mean that history is repeating itself, just like it always does, but under different circumstances each time. The global reserve currency has been closely aligned with the overarching power in the world at that moment in history. Now, China being a rising power, many would imagine seeing it as the focus of the next reserve currency. While in theory, China would not mind having most of the world trade be conducted in yuan, but given the Triffin dilemma that the US faces today, this would be an obstacle. The Triffin dilemma is nothing but the conflict of economic interests that arises between short-term domestic and long-term international objectives for countries whose currencies serve as global reserve currencies. The use of the US dollar for global trade creates a big demand for dollars from all over the world, leading to the dollar strengthening relative to other global currencies. This dollar strength made US exports become uncompetitive compared to its peers overseas. This has led to the hollowing out of the US manufacturing sector and a flight of jobs over the past few decades. This has imposed high costs on those who work in blue-collar jobs across many areas of the US. China, being an export-led economy, would not want to fall into the same trap as the US. While they would like to have global trade denominated in yuan in principle as a matter of national pride, it wouldn't be possible without their exports, which is a big part of their economy, becoming more expensive. Also, for all trades to settle in yuan, China would have to export yuan to many other nations who would need yuan to settle trade with their trading partners. Given the strict capital controls in China, it would be surprising if China allowed a lot of yuan to go out of the country to foreign shores. China has benefited from the dollar system, running up trade surpluses year after year, where they can have their exports cheaper due to the dollar's strength, so they would not mind having the reserve currency as something other than their own currency. Even if China wanted to set up yuan as a default reserve currency, the question is that would other nations fully embrace it? Today, due to tensions with the West, Russia is forced into friendship with China, but they were not on the best terms always. For decades, China has had border issues with Russia. From time to time, China has brought up their territorial claims on the Russian Far East, including Vladivostok, which they say were given up by China as part of unequal treaties during their 150 years of humiliation with foreign powers, and now they want it back. Many other Asian neighbors, including India, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, etc., with whom China has adversarial relations, would also be extremely cautious of adopting a yuan-based reserve currency, where they would be dependent on China to obtain yuan for their trading. Also, in the event of military hostilities with China or its allies, like what Russia is facing right now, they could be cut off from the reserve currency yuan, which would be a determining factor to them. In 1944, during the Bretton Woods conference, British economist John Maynard Keynes proposed Bancor, a new neutral reserve currency that could be used for settling international accounts. However, the US overruled this proposal in favor of a system of fixed exchange rates, using the US dollar as a reserve currency, which was a gold standard currency for central banks. A return to a system like Bancor, proposed by Keynes in 1944, would require active cooperation between many nations across the world. With active geopolitical tensions among the various set of nation pairs like Russia and the USA, USA and China, Europe and Russia, Saudi Arabia or UAE and Iran, etc., the chances of another Bretton Woods kind of consensus are next to none. Now, in future, there is a possibility of a world where neutral assets like gold or even Bitcoin being used to settle transactions for cross-border trade. Gold and Bitcoin, being neutral assets, removes the triffin dilemmas for nations while also providing options which are also to an extent free of counterparty risk. Gold has been used as a medium of exchange for centuries. Gold reserves can be kept locally, which eliminates depending on other nations to purchase dollars or yuan or some other currency to effect trade. Russia already is reportedly considering accepting payment for natural gas from quote-unquote unfriendly nations in gold. This eliminates the need to convert the dollars into rubles they get for oil and gas payments, which is now harder given the sanctions. Russia has one of the highest gold reserves in the world at $130 billion plus, which they can use as collateral to trade. Greater adoption of gold-backed trading is bound to increase the price of gold, in which case, given their large reserves, it is going to benefit them the most. Nations could directly trade with each other in gold, eliminating the threat of sanctions via third parties. However, transporting huge amounts of gold between nations would have its unique challenges in terms of transportation, security, and insurance for such transfers. Gold also requires laborious audit for its weight, quality and purity, which would be additional costs in this kind of monetary system. One can, in theory, settle the trade between two nations on a net basis versus trying to pay by gold for every small transaction between both. But this would entail the government having to pay the individual entities till the overall trade is settled as one final transaction. unlike gold, which is physically hard to move given its weight and the cost of security and transportation, Bitcoin has no such challenges. The amount of Bitcoin on the open ledger can easily be verified, and there is no counterparty risk if it is held securely by individuals or nations. Also, gold requires large-scale auditing and verification of its purity, which Bitcoin does not. Russia recently has indicated its willingness to even accept Bitcoin for its oil and gas. Accepting Bitcoin for all global trade right now would be a Bitcoin fan's ultimate dream. But given the amount of liquidity in the Bitcoin market, it would be interesting to see how such a thing would play out. More development in the Layer 2 application space, like Lightning Network, could help overcome this challenge. Now, Bitcoin also has its own challenges, like volatility, but that can be overcome by a mitigation mechanism, which instantly converts the Bitcoin transactions back into local fiat currencies. Bitcoin, with its low fees, either on the main chain or via L2 applications like the Lightning Network, would be cheaper in terms of costs to move money from buyer to seller compared to traditional finance channels. An example of this is the Lightning Network used by El Salvadorian nationals living outside their country and sending money to relatives or recipients back home via the Lightning Network versus traditional methods such as Western Union. The money is sent back home at a fraction of the cost compared to Western Union. Plus, there is no need for their family members or recipients to go to the nearest Western Union office, which could not only be time-consuming but also prone to interdiction by criminal gangs who could ask for their cut in exchange for safe passage. And the shift from traditional channels to Bitcoin is expected to save El Salvador $400 million every single year. But here is the problem. As Bitcoin is decentralized, it would be exceedingly hard for nation-states to block other nations from trading in it, making it highly censorship and sanction-resistant. A nation does not have to remain in fear that antagonizing Nation A, where it parks its forex reserves, or angering Nation B, which has the global reserve currency, can inflict economic pain if it does not do the bidding of the other nation. With Bitcoin, no government or a set of actors can inflate the currency away or manipulate it to the detriment of other nations. So sanctions become obsolete in this scenario, and that can be difficult given the existence of countries like North Korea. It would just mean that sanctions against North Korea would be lifted automatically, and already North Korean hackers are single-handedly responsible for billions of dollars worth of crypto thefts every single year. Even back in 2017, the WannaCry malware was none other than North Korea's doing. The recent events have brought into focus the pitfalls of a reserve currency where other nations can't control their own reserves and hence their own economic destiny. And sanctions are not even limited to countries like North Korea or Venezuela, but even friendly nations could turn on each other, and the result of it could very well be bigger nation forcing the smaller ones to mold its behavior as per the bigger nation's liking. This has brought into focus neutral assets that are harder to sanction, block and seize, such as gold and Bitcoin. So keeping all these in mind, a shift to assets like Bitcoin may not be too far away. In the future, Russia and even other nations might opt out of the current system by explicitly denominating a barrel of oil in ounces of gold or a cubic foot of natural gas in satoshis, that is, a smaller unit of Bitcoin. Given the current commodity price spikes, many nations might be forced to pay Russia by these new mechanisms due to the lack of choices. That is, forced to the new payment system, kicking and screaming, versus gradually adopting it voluntarily. This does not mean that the US dollar will lose its reserve assets tomorrow, but it is on the way out, like on the geopolitical front. As the world moves from a unipolar American to a multipolar world, there could be something similar in the economic sphere where we could have multiple reserve currencies operating at the same time. The 2020s decade has been one of massive upheaval with all sorts of problems. Pandemic, supply chain issues, massive central bank printing, inflation, geopolitical tensions, great power rivalry, war, commodity price shocks, etc. Given the events of the past couple of years in this decade, it would be hard to say what the future holds in terms of the next reserve currency, be it gold or Bitcoin or something else. But it would not be surprising if the dollar loses its global reserve currency status by the end of this decade. If you found this documentary helpful, let us know in the comments. And you might want to watch others just like this one on this channel. Consider subscribing for that and hit the like button to make YouTube algorithm happy. And don't forget to check out further reading and sources in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Take care and goodbye for now.